Good. Well, thank you all for having me here. And Dan, it's great to be up here. Thank you, guys. I am impressed. I have to say, it sounds very echoey. Is that just I put it maybe at a distance? Is that?
You're just.
I am too loud, I guess. Oh, but I thought if anyone's listening. Yeah. So it does sound very tinny, doesn't it? Okay. I'm not sure what the right management style for this is. So maybe we'll just do this. It does sound like there's some weird. Anyway, I'm not sure what the. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's really fun to get to do this on two levels. One, this is certainly critical time for us moving science, engineering into policy and into action, and into policy and into action are not always the same thing. And I'll try to highlight a little bit of that. And it's really a pleasure just because one of the things that I was asked to do is the most intimidating one, not talking about what we're working on in our lab, but I was asked to start with several minutes of my own path. And so that's harder. So I did do that. Let me just kind of orient things a little bit. Any of the stuff I'll show today is available on the two kind of social outreach parts of my rail laboratory, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. So just the website of the lab. And then the Twitter feed, I guess maybe we don't use Twitter after today anymore. I'm not, we have to catch up with what's going on, but this is the Twitter feed of my lab. So we try to do a message or two a day about what's going on. This is not Dan's vacation pictures, although sometimes it gets accused of being that. So I was trained in physics. I actually planned to be an astronaut until I got to Houston and I failed the vision test, quite to my surprise. So I did undergrad in physics and graduate school in physics and worked on a range of analytic projects, mainly around dynamical systems theory. So kind of applied math. And that led me in a strange way to a postdoc in physics and neuroscience, which I didn't know was a thing at that time. It was basically how simply can you model the brain? You think about the brain as a whole bunch of diodes, which it sort of is. So there was a connection. It still exists today. When I joined the group of people working on it, there were wet lab biologists that were sticking needles, electrodes into brains to record the output of cells. And there was another group modeling them as simply as possible. So it was an interesting time. Those communities have kind of evolved in a different direction now, and you can do with multi-probes, you can get hundreds of neurons firing all at once, and back then doing 2 or 3 was a big deal. So I went to Caltech, where there's a whole center on doing this. In fact, my advisor now runs the Paul Allen Brain Institute in Seattle. So I worked on a whole range of projects in this area, but during the summers, I worked for the Sandinista government of Nicaragua, and we were working on appropriate technology projects in the classic form, and probably only a few of us in the room, like Dan and I, have read books like Small's Beautiful in much detail. There's a few others that have. There was a particularly interesting chapter, and for a physicist, it was the shortest chapter. It was called Buddhist Economics. That's become an interesting kind of subfield. But I worked for the Sandinista government at a time when the US government was embargoing Nicaragua. Ronald Reagan and the so-called Contras were fighting against the Marxist insurgency in Central America. So I got into clean energy projects, and my first papers that weren't like this in the classic physics literature were about distributed small-scale energy systems, solar ovens, small wind turbines, a variety of things. And during my 2.5 years at Caltech, I kind of figured out, oh, this was a thing. So I didn't know about EGG, I didn't know about ERG at Berkeley, I didn't know about the sister program at Carnegie Mellon, all the things that I hope some of you guys considered as you found where you wanted to land. I was totally ignorant of all this. I knew about physics and I knew about NASA. That was really it. And so I moved into this area trying to leverage as much of those kind of analytic skills as possible, because I had not thought through a training in interdisciplinary or kind of the topics that go into this. So my path, while fun for me, and maybe it's just so long ago that it's irrelevant, definitely is not a very good model. And in fact, when I was an undergraduate at Cornell doing physics courses, and I took 1 or 2 classes that reached out far. When I went from physics to applied physics, I already viewed that as kind of, oh, it's pretty far. But there was one professor I got to know, and she was in the top floor of the physics building in the history of science department. And her path, if I had listened, I probably wouldn't have done any of this, because she was a former physicist who became a lawyer, who wrote an amazing book called Science at the Bar, how science gets used and abused in the process. And when Sheila Jasanoff, was tenured at Cornell, they couldn't even figure out where to put her. So she was tenured in the entire arts college, not even into the department she was actually in. And so back in the 90s, that would have been a pretty off-putting and daunting kind of process. So I am glad of my ignorance, but I'm also glad that you guys have a much more savvy and connected view of all these areas. So I've consistently tried to do that, and I'll do a mixture of what we're doing today and kind of a little bit of a tour of the project areas that we've worked on. And I'll jump into one just because Dan and I connected on it fairly early on, and that is one of the topics when I moved to Berkeley. I was at Princeton for 4 years as a junior faculty first, in their school policy, which had a different name then that we don't use anymore. And so one of my early projects when I got to Berkeley in the Energy Resources Group, but also in the Department of Nuclear Engineering, where my lab physically was, it's moved since, and in their school policy, the Goldman School, was to think through the energy and analytics around what looked to some people at the time in the early 2000s to be future of transportation, and that was biofuels. And so the life cycle analysis of our biofuels, in fact, good substitutes for liquid petroleum fuels. Are they a step in the wrong direction is what we kind of weighed in on. And Dan and I might tell this part of the story somewhat differently. So it'd be interesting if you chime in. So I directed our team of students and some colleagues and faculty to build a life cycle model of the fuels that were being debated at the time. Diesel, regular petroleum, and then the various bio blends, biodiesels, a whole variety of features. We wrote this paper that caused a lot of attention. I've never been called by both the Republican and the Democrats campaign team when they were campaigning for president. They each wanted, and they had very different takes on what might be the outcome of this paper. So we did this big life cycle analysis where we reverse engineered the pathway analyses that were available at the time, and concluded, and the paper was the strongest title that I could think to write on the pro biofuel side, and that is that ethanol can contribute, but our analysis pointed in kind of a very different direction, in the sense that there was a marginal benefit for biofuels over gasoline, but it was very context specific, depending precisely how that biofuel had been cultivated, fertilized, watered, etc. It was kind of a weak win. And again, the telling of this story may be different on the Berkeley-Davis side of the story, but for us, the key feature wasn't the straightforward, and it's never straightforward in this area, but wasn't the progress into the direct life cycle analysis, that's the blue. It was the thornier piece, and that is the indirect land use penalty that you have to get to. And I see some nodding heads, so maybe I won't delve into the story, but so my team subversively at Berkeley subversively thought that while there was a lot of push, there was billions of dollars, there was farm state votes, there was all of this stuff in favor of ethanol, we actually thought that the pathway that made the most sense back in 2005, 6, 7 was to not make biofuels the core feature. Not only were there different views around campuses and universities, but people's own recollections of the story seems to have changed somewhat. So we thought the subversive piece was to highlight not just the life cycle analysis of those fuels, but to look at the fuels that were not seen as super popular at the time that actually looked like far better deals. And that was like, Dan can't resist.
Since you provoked me, I'll say that while that was brilliant work from a political perspective, that is probably what almost killed the low carbon fuel standard, the fact that we did include it.
Well, I'm going to say it differently, actually. So I think that it was the harder part. I mean, so everyone was focused over here on the left in terms of is ethanol or Brazilian sugarcane going to be the savior? But I actually think that this made the work harder, meaning all the things that were not key parts of the story at the time, but the energy analysis clearly showed a win. And you'll notice these light green bars are controversial to this day. And just maybe to add the other piece, at the same time I was working with, before he was Secretary of Energy, Steve Chu, and a synthetic biologist at Berkeley, we got invited to write a little proposal to BP. And BP was in the process of debating changing its name at that time. It was from BP to Beyond Petroleum, back to BP. It's a little like KFC, you know, they were Kentucky Fried Chicken, then they were Kitchen Fresh, and now they're KFC, and it means nothing. But anyway, so we, with a 9-page proposal, won $500 million. It was kind of a lot. Definitely the best, you know, dollar per page I've ever written in a grant proposal. And Berkeley split it with University of Illinois. Most of the team, though, was still focused on these things. So I agree, Dan, it was hard work here. But I think if we hadn't had the better science roots in there, we would have we've had a hard time in the process because the understanding of indirect land use is still not consistent around the world today, even though I think if you go in and look at any of the global trade models, it's a very clear story. Not everyone believes that, not even in my own building on campus at Berkeley. So we worked through a process that ultimately led to the low carbon fuel standard. It's had it's been a challenging process. I'm still disappointed that the federal government, even though the EPA has looked at it a few times, and you can find an LCFS analysis page on the EPA website, has not gone to get it. I actually think that as of today, this is an ideal framework for thinking through from the science to options that can be worked on the policy sphere. So it's got a complicated path, but I would say this opened the door and ultimately led to what is now this interesting situation where, you know, other places are catching up with us now, but after China with the most EVs in the world and Norway with the highest percentage of EVs in the world, California was the clear leader. Now actually some European states are actually eclipsing us in terms of number of vehicles. So an interesting kind of mix in this process. The other thing that was going on for me at this time, again, I claim my path was absolutely a random walk, not a planned walk, is that I was also have been working in the IPCC since 1999. So we come up with several of the reports. The reports keep getting delayed in time. We kept doing sub-reports around technology transfer, around aerosol, around contrails and the airplane, and a whole variety of other issues came up. But it led to an interesting pathway, and the amusing Berkeley piece that I just got a letter last week about is, so those of you who've been to Berkeley know that when you get a Nobel Prize, and technically I did not win a Nobel Prize, right? This is contributions to the IPCC. It's not the same thing, no check, no nothing. But at Berkeley, you got a parking space, right? And that's quite critical for a small urban campus. And so there was a debate. It was like a 3-year process. There were 4 of us at LBL and Berkeley who should have partaken in it. And we finally did get the awarded parking. But back then there were very few electric cars. And so we got parking. Didn't do a whole lot. I don't think I've ever actually used the bicycle parking spot. But now I was told I should put a letter in to say now that EVs are the thing, and if you do solar on your roof and batteries, et cetera, you can your equivalent mileage can be quite remarkable. So that's really kind of the pathway. So now you know how I got to where I am in about as much coherence as I can tell it, because I didn't plan it. So that is not meant to discourage, that's meant to encourage the students, because you guys have a much better thought through suite of options to kind of get into the field. So maybe one last part of the connection, most of my appropriate technology work it's been focused in Africa, but over the last 10 years, the rise of research partnerships and institutions in China, all of which have been on in-person hold quite seriously due to COVID, is now a big part of my lab team. So we've worked on a lot of different projects with a whole suite of Chinese universities around electric vehicle issues, around integration of energy storage, around innovations in the grid, including the project I'll mention in a bit, where we were actually able to get entire cities to replace 100% of their gas-powered taxis in a matter of months. I mean, an amazing speed. In Shenzhen, we went from 0 to 31,000 EV taxis in 9 months. And the only remaining gas-powered taxis are specialty vehicles, larger vans and things. I think the other fun part for me is that with these kind of really neat teams of students who've been getting involved in all kinds of other interesting types of partnerships, some of which I didn't enter thinking there was going to be a research angle of them at all. So I got a call out of the blue that my wife didn't believe to go design the renewable energy system for Richard Branson. So I went down to his island, designed the system, which he promptly then didn't install. And then got a call from one of his other billionaire, not quite a billionaire, one of his other celebrity friends, who said, well, you know that system you designed for Sir Richard, could you actually come and build it in my place? And I promise we'll do it. So Richard, 5 years later, still hadn't built it. And we were called by Marlon Brando before he died. And we did install this 100% renewable energy system on this absolutely amazing island in the South Pacific. 100% renewable energy. It's got incredible flow battery technology. It's got some really cool things we designed to do salt water, cold water, air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, what happens is people fly 10,000 miles in airplanes to get there. So, yeah, that's the right way to put it. Along the way, I got to host a TV series called Economies that was basically like a game show of competing clean energy technologies against each other, and have gone back and forth in and out of federal service. So I initially served in the Clinton administration when the US was trying to redesign the criteria for what would be a better nuclear reactor than the ones we had, the so-called Generation 4 process that haltingly has led to the small modular reactors that are going to be installed later this decade. I served in the Obama administration as the science envoy, which is sort of ambassador without a portfolio. I worked in Africa and the Middle East on clean energy partnerships, but my term extended beyond when President Obama was in office, which meant I went from working for Secretary Kerry to, it pains me to say it, Secretary Tillerson. That was challenging, and so when President Obama left office, he wrote me a nice letter saying thank you for doing this, but my term continued and things went downhill, shall we put it mildly. So when I was going to leave, I watched as the U.S. under Mr. Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement and other things. So I actually went into Secretary Tillerson's office and said, I'm going to resign. And I said, I'm going to do it in as loud a way as I know how. And he said, I got my own problems with the guy. And in fact, he was fired over Twitter shortly thereafter. So I did send in my resignation letter. And I don't think anybody read it because I wrote this letter. I was very proud of the fact that I cited Democrats and Republicans in it, et cetera, et cetera. But everyone read it differently than reading the paragraphs. They read something I buried in it. And true to form, the first reporter that called me in the morning when I did this was that intentional? So, no. So anyway, so I wrote this letter and I did my best to listen to my PR handler, my then 18-year-old daughter. And she said, if you do this, Dad, you need to do two things. You need to send it out early in the morning in California. So it's morning in the East Coast and Europe hasn't shut down. And you need to get the best well-known person you know to retweet it. So I did that. I said, I think I can find someone. And so I did exactly that. And she kindly agreed to retweet it. I know that she is now seen differently than she was back then, but she was willing to retweet it. It did go out, and for that classic 15 minutes of whatever else, it was a complicated couple days. It got a lot of attention. I got targeted by Breitbart that tracked down. I put all my email through campus security screens. We put my physical mail. This is back when there was various compounds being sent to members of Congress. So it was a complicated mess. So now I've really caught you back up. I think the most amazing thing is you guys. And I know that students don't always think this, that it's hard to find the right graduate program. It's hard to find the right support. What I actually find is the opposite, that students are the scarce resource, that everything else is fungible. But quality students who really want to dig in and learn things in areas they haven't done is really the hard part of the story. So I've been super lucky. Rick Duke, one of my students, is currently the deputy spec. He is the deputy special presidential climate envoy for working for Secretary Kerry. Tracy Osborne runs the UC-wide Environmental Justice Institute. Carla Peterman was a CEC commissioner before she got her PhD. And then she was a member of the PUC. Now she's vice president of PG&E. I don't really envy that job right now. And kind of an interesting range of folks. Ryan Shelby runs the Energy Engagement Office for Southern Africa at USAID. So it's been kind of a remarkable mix. And so what I thought I'd focus my actual comments on, not this long intro I was asked for, was what do we do to actually make environmental justice actionable? Not a great thing to lead talks with and the lead line at every single opening speech at the COP in a week and a half is going to have EJ in it in some form. And that's great. There's wonderful PR, but you have to actually bake it in, not sprinkle it on top, in the words of Manuel Pastor. So trying to go from the really important raising the flag to how do we make this core to project areas so that we actually learn things, right? So, people are shocked and horrified by the floodings in Pakistan. A third of the country was underwater at peak. But anybody who's studied the region, 11 years ago, almost the exact same thing happened. Almost no one in the international energy development, civil engineering world did a damn thing about it. And there was requests from the Pakistan government to the Asian Development Bank that they needed infrastructure support around dams, they needed solar pumps, a whole variety of things. No response. And I would regard that as a evidence-based failure, right? We can be surprised by bad things that happen in the greenhouse going forward, but it's kind of a different level of crime against humanity if we have data, we see what goes on, countries and governments actually request support, and we don't do it. And that's exactly the Pakistan story. So what I'm kind of trying to focus on here is what are some of the ways that I think we didn't just kind of do work that revealed environmental injustice. That's a good start, but that's something we should have been doing 30 years ago. How do we address environmental injustice in ways that we do things normatively and progressively different? And I think there's lots of great research projects. I see them all the time. I love them. But a big part of the challenge, I think, is that we are not obviously thinking differently about the projects that we take on. And I mean that in a very upstream way. It is not difficult because there is so much racial and gender injustice in the world. It's not that hard to find and build data sets about injustice. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but we need to be more creative. And so at least for me, the way to be more creative isn't just to double down on the things that I feel like I'm good at. Building computational models, engaging on what could we do differently in a theoretical sense, building hardware, trying to get in the field, is to kind of really think differently about project areas. And so my laboratory today is a wonderful place. These are all the graduate students. I haven't listed the undergraduates here, and I didn't have all the right thumbnail pictures handy. But my team is a really interesting mix, a scholar from Nigeria, from South Sudan. Annalise is living right now in Tanzania. Jess and Sam, doing two different projects, are currently living in Uganda. Sam is working in the Congo. Lynn is from Kenya. Nadilla is part of the Indonesia transportation team. So it's really a pleasure to get pushed onto projects and areas that I wouldn't necessarily have done. I worked for 30 years in Africa, but many of the topics that come up are not things that I think I would have found without a team of students looking for different ways to do things that I think that my at least applied math to analysis to whatever it would have led to. And that's led to many of the projects that I kind of highlighted before to you. So I think that's in many ways the biggest kind of lesson in the process, and an example of that is something that we just released on Monday, and that is in part through that work in French Polynesia and running a large research consortium around community rights and threats to the environment. One of the things that came out of that is we are all fixated, and I'm sure I won't get to the slides, but I have a lot of slides later on about what the materials crisis or the materials demand for the clean energy economy is going to lead to in terms of lithium and neodymium and cobalt, coltan, a whole variety of things for electric vehicles, for solar panels, for wind turbines, for who knows what else we're going to come up with. And so one of the challenges is there is now a suite of companies that have launched themselves to do deep seabed mining. And at a high level, their argument is one that is already catching on a number of places, right? We know there's opportunities, there's both seabed nodules, but there's seabed materials available. We should mine there. And the fact that we know arguably more about the dark side of the moon than the deep ocean floor should say anyone who kind of takes a sign, what can science do to think through these options, to take pause. And so just earlier this week, Sylvia Earle, I believe her official title is Her Deepness. And I wrote a piece where we've been buffeted many times a day since Monday about deep sea mining, and some governments have said we are open for business. The Cook Islands said mine as much as you want. Indonesia said, New Zealand and French Polynesia have said no, we are supporting a moratorium, and the US has been silent on this so far. And so using my ability to prod people in DC, we've been trying to raise this case. And so Ed in Egypt in a week and a half, we'll be doing a lot on this process. The other challenge, again, the next two slides won't be a surprise to anybody here, but that is, as hard as I feel like, some people in my generation have worked on these topics, the history of what we've gotten done at one level is horrific, right? We've had meeting after meeting, we've written thicker and thicker reports, greenhouse gas levels are rising. The estimate is that, of course, we need to cut emissions by at least 50% by the end of the decade, and current forecasts are 1%. Right? So we are not even in the game when it comes to the kind of meaningful change numbers that we want to get at. That said, the more positive version of that same story is that if we go back 2 years to that dark time that followed the Obama good time, if you look at historical emissions, that line on the left, and you look at the policies that were in place at that time, just 2 years ago, we were going to be in this aquamarine band, so 3 degrees C rise, plus or minus. It's easy to be pessimistic for all these numbers and say you'll never get there, the numbers are going to be higher. But if we look at what is on the table, that's a pretty horrifically changed world, right? That means everything from marine food production drops dramatically to no tropical corals, to the kind of fires we've seen in California and Australia and Greece and Siberia being a regular new season, which it may already be. But getting to that green zone, that less than 1.5 degrees, that again, it's easy to be skeptical and say there's no way to do that. I don't believe that, by the way. I think there is still a way, there is a pathway to get there. But we have to pass through this kind of, these optimistic scenarios to make those green ones even possible. And starting point of that is the painfully slow moving and painfully ineffective climate process. And this is what countries in the world have pledged. Everywhere in red or in yellow are places that have net zero carbon dates, which they have officially adopted, that are 2050 or earlier. The purple are 2060, unacceptably late. But almost no one in the red or the orange actually has a viable path or path that they're making happen to get to those numbers by the dates they've set. There are a couple nice little green dots that are kind of interesting stories, largely due to the accident of geography or the accident of large hydro and defining large hydro as green, even though we, of course, in California do not count large hydro or nuclear as part of our RPS targets. So the other kind of intro thing I would say is that that's a bad story and people will hem and haw about it at the COP meeting in Egypt next week. I just think what happened last year, the COP in Glasgow. And who was in Glasgow? Really? Okay. I think what happened in Glasgow last year is kind of emblematic. At the meeting, it's the first time that the global pledge to provide $100 billion, supposed to be $100 billion a year, every year, to industrializing countries happened. That's great. It's not clear how much of that $100 billion that was pledged even a year ago has actually made a transfer. And of course, the critical meeting that happened right before the COP in Glasgow, the week before in Milan, was that the G20 nations got together and they voted collectively not to end subsidies for fossil fuels. Right. So, you say what you want, you show your best PowerPoints in the COP meeting, and then a week before, you've chosen to continue fossil fuel subsidies. We're just not getting it. So one way to think about this is what level of innovation, what level of progress would be acceptable, what would get us on a path. And there's lots of ways to do it. What Amory Lovins and some students and I worked on together was to track what has been the level of innovation in decarbonization. And if you look back into the 1980s, the rate of improvement, remember emissions are going up, but the rate of making economies more energy and carbon efficient globally averaged a little over 1% a year. And the best we've ever done as a global community is almost 3% a year. That was in the end of the Obama days before the Trump, Bolsonaro, now what's going on in Italy and elsewhere. But we have never eclipsed 3% a year. We've got close once and then fell right back down. We're going to do a new paper, of course, now that we've got a couple of years of hopefully direct money in the other direction, and we need a little bit of time for the Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Act, to get out of bookkeeping stage into action. But this 3% a year is a pretty good milestone, because if you think about it, we've got 30 years, go from 2020 up to 2050. If you're over 3% a year, you're at least in the game. Doesn't mean you're going to get there, but you're at least kind of in the ballpark. That's pretty simple math. And we're not there now. And so how much we turn R&D, enthusiasm, PowerPoints, budget hearings into companies, deployments, national and area policies that actually get put into action. I think that's really the test. And that's why I think that you guys are the scarce resource. It is actually not money and GSR, or whatever you call it. We call it graduate, they call GSRs here too, okay. So research positions, back when I was in school, we called them TAs and RAs. So this GSR, California language is still alien to me. But I actually think that it's students pushing on topics that are not part of the status quo that is the really critical resource. And so one of the most exciting success stories to me has been what has happened due to lots and lots of hard work on the research side, on the market side. It has not been a pretty story. It's sausage making, you shouldn't watch it. But the sausage making on the price declines for clean energy technologies has been remarkable, right? This is the learning curve, Moore's law, however you want to describe it, with the cost declines in the last 10 years. Solar and storage costs have dropped by 90%. Actually, storage is doing a little better than solar ever did, which is kind of interesting footnote. And wind costs have fallen by about 60%. So that remarkable starting ground is great. People tell stories of what were the critical features of these learning curves in different ways. But what we did in my lab, just after we finished that biofuels work I mentioned before, was to put this into a larger framework and try to take that wonderfully distilled message from Bloomberg that it is now cheaper to build a new renewable energy power plant than to simply operate an existing fossil fuel plant. Right? That's a remarkable statement when you think about it on multiple levels. One, it's wonderful to distill it down so much. I definitely am impressed with Mayor Bloomberg's PR team. But also the fact that even here in California, you can walk around and talk to people in the know, in utilities and various agencies, and they may or may not have seen this statement, but many of them do not believe it. And that's a really interesting point. They're either correct that all of these things like the fossil fuel subsidies, like political inertia are so great, or we are not doing a good enough PR job. And I don't mean PR by better ad campaigns. I mean by actually building new hardware that changes that story. I think that's really the interesting piece. So for me, what that meant was to try to do the most open source modeling package of the most economies that we could, and start with basic electrical engineering, power systems, for the electrical engineers in the room, capacity expansion models of utility grids is what my lab builds. My own model is called Switch. We've been building various iterations of it now for 12 years. And all the places in green are ones where we built the model in partnership with people in government and at universities and NGOs. And the government officially adopted the model in some way or another. So in California, we initially built Switch for here because we got money from both the foundation and the Air Resources Board. And Switch is one of the 3 models that the state uses to do evaluation of their planning operations. It doesn't mean they always listen to what we say, in fact, far from it, but it's in, we get regular calls from ARB, from state senators, from the governor's office saying, would you mind doing a run where you entirely zero out energy from hydropower? Because we think it's going to be so unreliable in 20 years. We need scenarios that are with our kind of inside the tent software. And then we, of course, expanded from California to all of the WEC. We did Nicaragua for obvious reasons, since I was working there still. Chile, now we have Mexico. Actually, Mexico should be green now, it's just in the blue phase. And then East Africa, which has been trying to build a power pool very much like we have in Western US. So we initially built it for Kenya and used it to defeat a coal-fired power plant that was being proposed, ironically, to be adjacent to a UNESCO World Heritage Environmental Site. Just these stories almost can't make them up. And now the rest of the power pool, we're in discussion in my Power Africa kind of role as EC. Our largest team is working in China. which has been an interesting challenge because US-Chinese relations are not exactly ideal at the moment. And then we work quite a bit in East Malaysia and in Kalimantan. And so the modeling package that we do looks entirely familiar to anyone who does capacity expansion models. You know, we simply minimize the net present value of the total costs on the system, and that's capital cost plus what are the operational and variable costs of a system. And this is the simplest possible balancing. It's energy generated equals energy used plus energy that goes into storage. You can't get any simpler than that. But the complications of even setting that up under different technical and different regulatory regimes is pretty complicated. So you'll notice right here, for example, just hidden in this annual demand, we have 1 plus the reserve margin. Anyone know what the reserve margin in California is?
Is it just raised to 17.5?
Yeah. So I would argue California is taking the reserve margin and going in exactly the wrong direction, right? The idea that you raise the reserve margin, effectively what you're doing is you're saying we need this much more power than what our peak demand is. I'll get back to, there's all these complications. We look at average demand, peak demand, but the fact that what I just said about renewables being cheaper and storage being now much more available, actually, I claim that the real version of that Bloomberg statement is that it's now cheaper to build renewables plus storage than to operate fossil fuels. And that gets trickier. Sorry, I didn't mean to do whatever.
So sorry.
Yeah, I know. I know the feedback. So I claim that the harder version of this statement is actually true. There are some people who don't think that's right, and there's good reasons why people disagree, because the costs of storage are kind of tricky. Not on a vehicle. When you buy a vehicle, you know how much storage you're getting when you buy your EV, or who has a hydrogen car in the room. Not that they've driven, because around here, of course, a lot of you have driven one, right? Who has driven a hydrogen car in this room? And that is not acceptable. You guys need to up your game a little bit, right? Who has driven an EV? And who owns an EV or leases an EV or has access to an EV? Exactly. So that's why what I'm saying is you guys are the scarce resource. You need to, at Berkeley today, the union of students is voting, right? Here too, you guys need to exercise your power, right? It doesn't make sense to have a super green, bike-friendly, EV-friendly campus, and then you drive here in a horribly low efficiency gas-powered vehicle, or that's how you got here. No, I mean bike here on campus, right? But just like my Techiroa story, right? You're wonderfully sustainable in your bubble in Berkeley or Davis, and then
fly 10,000 miles.
Exactly. Right. So, so the fact that the reserve margin, meaning the planning barrier, the planning insurance that's being built into the system, is increasing when people like me are saying renewables are cheap and storage is cheap, that means that we are being, blanking stupid, right? Because we know how to build reliable systems if we integrate the right amount of storage, if we, for example, convert, and I know we have the author of WEEP, the water planning model. I hope some of you have taken classes on WEEP here because it's a Davis product. The water planning model that we've linked to our switch model. We should be turning every single bit of hydropower that we choose to use in this state, and arguably in all of the West, but that's a little more controversial, into load following storage, and forget it on the front end generation side. That is a legacy gift to us from geography and from engineers in the past who screwed up quite a few rivers, but it's a gift, right? Clean energy is cheap. There's no better place in the world in terms of access to clean energy. Storage is cheap. We have more storage companies being created per unit. I'll get back to my units in a bit, but I would say the critical unit is not per unit time. It's not per unit dollars. It's per unit former student. That's the key unit in terms of cranking out new companies. I'll come back to that in a second. So the fact that we are increasing our reserve margin means we don't trust clean energy, right? And last month we had this peak event where we hit 46,000, then we hit 48, then we hit 52,000 megawatts of peak demand during the heat wave in September. And I would say nature was so incredibly kind to us. We didn't have winds. We didn't have big fires. We had fires, right? Ironically, in California, the town of Weed was burned down. We'll leave that aside. If you're from Weed, it's very bad, but it got a lot of interesting press outside of California. But we should be able to build out systems that do what we all say, that show the higher reliability, the higher jobs benefits, the environmental justice benefits of clean energy are huge. And I would say we all collectively failed to tell the story, because why did California not have brownouts a month ago? It was because demand side management and voluntary reductions happened. And it was because California has so much behind the meter solar and storage installed, of which utilities aren't getting credit, right? Utilities are battling against that distributed clean energy resource. Now, I suspect, except for the polite adults who never say what they really mean, but I suspect that most of us hate our utility, right? And if you don't hate your utility and you're under 30, I don't believe you. If you don't hate your utility and you're over 30, I claim it's because at one point you had a student who was placed highly, such as myself, or you got grants from the utility. Everyone else generally hates their utility in Northern California. When I moved here 23 years ago, PG&E was seen as the super innovative, awesome utility that was doing great things. And Southern California Edison was seen as the horrific, hang on to coal-fired power plant utility. And the world has flipped. PG&E sucks today. They have objected to solar, to batteries, to electric vehicles, to undergrounding power lines. You name a good energy environmental decision, PG&E has found a way to at least drag their feet, if not more so. And for us in Northern California, unless you were super grandfathered in, any clean energy you generate beyond your annual consumption is your gift to your utility. That makes no sense, right? Even SCE and even San Diego Gas and Electric. Any San Diego, right? You guys didn't love your utility. Even those two utilities have found ways to start rewarding people for generated solar. And yet here, the lower population density of the three utilities, big area, amazing solar, this legacy hydropower system, we're way behind. I mean, it's incredible. We don't talk. So there are really interesting things that are baked in here in complicated ways. And so this is a typical run of the switch model. The black line is demand. This is a demand scenario for 2050, and the colors are supposed to make sense. So light blue is wind, yellow is solar, dark blue is hydro, red is geothermal. There's an incredibly thin little band there of legacy nuclear. And then these negative going spikes are energy that goes into storage, and then it comes back out in the usage phase in these solid areas, right? So we build these models and these partnerships, and they've led to some pretty interesting kind of events. The first time we started to build statewide storage models using Switch in California was 2012. And 2 years later, we were able to get California to pass AB 2514, the storage mandate that required that by 2020, California would meet 2% of its peak demand with storage. Now notice, this means that we didn't get them to pass a basic energy course, right? That was a nice victory. That was seen as a level that would bring new clean energy into the market, but not so much the utilities would object, so we couldn't get it through. But the units that we described that storage mandate in were 2% of peak demand, right? One of you needs to object strongly to that language. And you've all taken Dan, other people's courses. Why is that the wrong, right? The actual wording was, by 2020, California must meet 2% of its peak demand with storage. Why did I fail my own test?
Because if you just do it by percentage, you can increase how much the peak is. So just a 2% could be 1, it could be 15. So
Okay, I'll buy that. That's not what I was thinking of. And I would argue actually that if all of our energy was clean with a low footprint, I would be happy if our demand rose, right? If our demand rose massively and our oil use went to 0, I would regard that as a victory. But it's a good point. Why am I failing everything that I've said to you guys by having written a piece of policy? I wrote that bill.
Energy content of the storage that you're discharging, so.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Back then, we wrote this in 2012. We had not, and I'll show you the next slide, we had not gotten to even our 20% clean energy mandate. So some of that energy that was being stored is from fossils. I'll give you that, but I'll come back to that. There's something much more fundamental. Right? One of you sort of said, Dan, you just said you were a physicist, and yet you don't even know how to do the most basic unit analysis.
Is it
Right?
the power? Is it because it's
Yeah,
power?
you don't write storage mandates in terms of kilowatts. You write them in terms of kilowatt hours, right? So the reason why we did it was because we didn't think at the time, based on some very strong feedback from members of the California State Senate, I won't mention their name, Nancy Skinner, that it would not be possible to convince utility CEOs to think in kilowatt hours. They would think in kilowatts, and so we gave into that. And so that's kind of the sausage making. Right now, the new mandate requires not only the amount of storage, the peak capacity, but duration, kilowatt hours of storage. And of course, we need both, right? So California saved itself from the blackouts last month. Nature was the biggest kind player, but we saved because demand side management kicked in about 2 to 3 gigawatts of capacity when we needed it. And California has something like, the fact that I can't give you a number already tells you something interesting. Between 10 and 11 gigawatts of solar behind the meter. The fact that I can't tell you the number is because the utility can't tell you the number. And that's because they have not been in favor of getting as much solar behind the meter as possible. So you would think in California with our sun, the fact that we don't have this in place is kind of a remarkable, bizarre situation. We stop at
11:50, but we usually take questions starting on the left or left.
Okay, I will get to that. So I'll do one more example. I'm going to skip then the example. You guys all know the fact that ours, as I mentioned, California's 2010 target was to be 20% powered by renewables. We missed that target. We threw a party. Our target for 2020 was 1/3 powered by renewables. And we met that target, having missed this target in 2017. So that's a pretty remarkable step. Then California's target was 50% by 2030, but we've increased that to 60% with the various bills that have gone into place. And that's an amazing path of ramping things up. Just this spring, California hit 104% of its demand being met by renewables, but for only 35 minutes in a nice spring day, et cetera. If we can hit 100% of demand, even in the kind springtime in the year 2022, we should be writing the most aggressive bills to move California's 2045 target massively forward in time. Because if you can do it even briefly then, that says this is not a technological hurdle. This is a allocation of funds, or since the governor just put in $56 billion, there is certainly money to do these things out there. So interesting. I'm not going to get into the details of the distributed off-grid roadmap, except to say that one of my main jobs, and the reason why I like being in DC as well as here, is that I got to craft and be in charge of a program now at USAID, which is set up to electrify health clinics and hospitals across Africa with the goal of providing clean, reliable energy to 100% of all of the clinics that are not on reliable grids today. We think that's about 100,000 health clinics across the continent, and we are somewhere today at around 2,000 of those are powered by distributed mini grids with lots of cool hardware options, all kinds of interesting aspects of the story working on. And so here, whoops, I don't know what I just did there. I'm kind of, something weird is So here is from last year's COP meeting, myself along with the director of Power Africa. I hope you guys know who this is, Damilolo Ogunbi. She's the UN Special Representative for Energy Access. Charity Kazor is the Nigerian Minister of Environment. And so working on these kinds of projects. So I want to use my last 3 minutes to highlight one example of using the data to get somewhere that I think we never should have had to get to, but it highlights the challenges. I think that these got dropped. We'll skip all those cool learning curve math bits. Someone should ask about the learning curve thing in the Q&A. I'll back to that. So I mentioned before that we don't even know how many solar systems there are in California. Can you imagine how embarrassing that is? We are a state where we're GPSed out the wazoo, where we have data on absolutely everything when we're in the land of Fang and Silicon Valley, and we can't count up the number of solar systems in our state. Even leaving aside those that are for grow rooms in the north, we won't get it usage. But that's unbelievably primitive, right? So it turns out no utility has and or will release that data for a variety of reasons. They don't want to show basically that solar and storage is not upturning the grid and causing communism to sprout in, Davis and Berkeley and all kinds of places. So we teamed up with Google and used their Project Sunroof, that I suspect some of you have used in the room. And so we mapped out all 60 million rooftops in America and used that to identify with some pretty cool machine learning stuff. It goes back to my neural networks days, where solar is. Turns out that solar panels on a roof are pretty hard to identify because they look like skylights. They look like air conditioners. They look all kinds of things. So if you don't get data several times during the day and figure out this is a solar panel, right? Because the angle of the sun can make a solar panel look like a window, like an air conditioner, all kinds of things. So we did some pretty cool stuff. On the machine learning side, we wrote some very, very CS algorithm types of papers. And basically used all of that to identify solar around the country, including my favorite solar installation in the country is not in the grow room very near where I camp a lot in Anderson Valley. Turns out that the Coal Museum in Lexington, Kentucky now has solar on the roof. So I feel there are some interesting little bits of things going on. So we did all this work to identify where the solar is. And the other piece of information that you can't get, and I think this is correct, you can't get it is impossible to then get the racial composition and the income of every single household that has or doesn't have solar, right? That would be very invasive. So what we did was a proxy. We said, we're going to look at neighborhoods defined around census tracts, so basically blocks. I won't get into the details, but census tracts are smaller in urban areas and larger in rural areas. But we looked at those areas across the whole country, and we said if a given area, given census tract, is more than 50% one ethnic group, we're just going to say it's majority of that group. That's a crude measure. You can argue about it in lots of ways. You can have a poor area of one ethnic group, but say on a ridge line, you have a bunch of white people living in fancy homes. We've seen a few of those in California. So we use this admittedly second-rate metric as the way to look at things. And so what we then said is, what is in fact the prevalence of solar? And we looked at rentals and we looked at home ownership separately, but I won't get into that because I'm over my time threshold. And so what we put this all together. And what we found is that if you're a community with no clear ethnic majority, that's the green, that's your baseline. But if it's a white majority community, from people living below the poverty line, for a family of four, the poverty line is $26,600 a year, which is embarrassing, but we won't get into that right now. That solar from the poorest to the richest is 30 to 50% more likely than the average. African-American and Latinx majority communities, it's 50 to 70% less likely, even across this range of income. Now, if I had just said solar is more common on white-owned or white-rented properties, I don't think anybody would have been surprised in this room. But if I said that's true over an order of magnitude difference in income, think more of you would have been surprised. Now, the reason why the error bars goes up is that sadly, there are just simply not that many African-American majority rich communities. There's some in Atlanta, there's just not that many. So what we find is that despite all of the rhetoric around solar is going to be part of the green energy transition, we're going to invest in justice, all these are great words, great PowerPoints, great speeches. In reality, we are, no surprise, applying the same set of dissemination distribution tools for these new technologies that we do for existing ones. And we already know that FICO scores are used to predatorily discriminate and take property from minorities in this country and from women who try to buy or have long-term stable leases. We also know that redlining and zoning is used as a predatory mechanism around the country. So it shouldn't surprise you, but it is disappointing, to put it mildly, to see as we move into the energy systems we need to deploy going forward, that we are doing it exactly the way and making exactly the same mistakes we made in the past. And so that's an example of, I would say, good machine learning, good data, revealing an issue, and the question is, where do you go from there? And so the nice part of getting this work done while I've been serving in DC is that we were able to have very immediate conversations. And I would say, and maybe we should discuss this a little bit, that of the funding in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's lots of cool aspects of it, but the piece I'm most proud of, is not the money for electric vehicles. It's not the money for heat pumps. It's the fact that $60 billion has been devoted for environmental justice. And if any of the money we're spending in the IRA, we need to track and to amplify and to spread to other agencies, it's that piece. Because that is the thing that didn't exist before. First of all, IRA didn't exist before, but the most transformative is that piece of spending. So I've gone over, I'm on slide 59 of, I only brought 105 slides. So I think we should stop right there and open it up for questions. And thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much. I think I have a couple questions. The first one is, could you talk a little bit about how you got into justice work coming from like a physics background?
No, no, I mean, I don't know what was the, I can't tie it together in any clear sort of bow, like my own path was. My wife is African-American. Obviously my kids are African-American, but I don't know what the driver was. I would say that, and again, this is the kind of story you tell after the fact, which I don't think is the same as the story you tell at the time. I do think that when you look at that early slide that I highlighted way back in the beginning, I think that part of my disappointment in all of us as people who were in the academy or worked on these projects and moved outwards was that we have been writing these increasingly dense and impenetrable and uninteresting reports now for decades. And we are not winning the climate battle by the numbers of publications and the numbers of fancy meetings that we have, because every time we turn around, we see that, you know, we are putting at best a slight thin green layer on a big dirty fossil fuel economy, right? So I would say, if anything, I have always been looking for what is the biggest way to upset the apple cart. And I would say the new mantra, at least kind of where I live, I think here too, but not everywhere, that we're not going to solve climate change without justice, and we're not going to solve injustice without addressing climate change. I find that to be very compelling. And so to this day, right now, one of the things we were able to get done at Berkeley, and we hire faculty in a fairly painful, slow, one faculty at a time way. But something that happened very interesting, I don't see the picture for it, so I won't put it up, is that we were given the chance to hire a new faculty member in the area of environmental justice 3 years ago. And I was chair of ERG at the time, and so we hired Yujin Chung, who works on gender and food systems in Africa. And campus thought it was a good idea. And so we made a petition to hire 5 faculty in environmental justice spread over campus. And stunningly, they agreed. So we then hired 5 more faculty, all in this area. And there's a very important little open square right here. There's someone who I'm not allowed to mention this person's name because she's holding a fairly prominent role right now. And so when that role ends, there'll be another box here. But so we hired all these faculty working on different aspects of justice. And then other departments on campus said, well, why didn't you ask us to be part of this? And I said, well, we've been asking you for 10 years and you were never interested. You in chemistry said, our work is basic, we don't do that. And so what has happened is that all of these hires happened by other units saying, we want to be part of this new roundtable on environmental justice, of which I co-chair with someone named Rachel Morella-Frosch, who's on the White House Council on Environmental Justice. So that was not exactly an answer to your question. That was more like just but I don't have a better answer than that.
No worries. Thank you. My second question is, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of your research, the justice portion is looking at like distributive justice. Do you see a way, or have you already incorporated like restorative justice or procedural justice in your work?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And for those who either taught or taken kind of justice-based courses, whether you're working from SENS, the idea of justice, or Searle's initial ideas, these different pathways. You can argue that the focus on mitigation and adaptation are very different in their restorative or adaptive or redistributive forms of justice. And I would say in the work that I feel like I'm best qualified to do, I feel like I've had my biggest successes in trying to defeat fossil policies and projects in favor of clean and distributed energy projects. And that has led me more and more towards this distributive side, because the policies in place are ultimately going to be the things that, like this case I mentioned about the inequality of who has solar as a function of race. That addresses a few of the things you're highlighting, but not the full range. So I would say in leveraging what I feel like my team does best, going from very technical applied math to some hardware deployment to these projects, that's been where I've sat. But that's actually why I think that this University of California-wide environmental justice group that Tracy Osborne runs is kind of a place to have those bigger dialogues. But my own piece has kind of had that focus consistently. So it's an interesting follow-up.
So my question is about California's Title 24 that's stating that all new houses that will be built should have solar panels.
Yep.
I don't know if there's any room for flexibility. So I was thinking, how realistic is it? Because the climate and geography in California, all of this California varies a lot. There might be shading issues, there might be weather issues.
Yep.
So how realistic?
So I wrote that, right? So and we wrote it in 2013. It took 7 years to get into operation. The first 5 years, the housing industry didn't think we were serious. They didn't think they would have to match up. 2020 happened, well, 2019 happened, and they went crazy. And there was a lot of arguments that we should back off in different ways. Pacifica is very cloudy, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, no, doesn't make sense. If you give in a little bit on it, then you open up the door for tons of exceptions. So what we did, and we finally got into the bill, was that there are no exceptions, but you can appeal. And that's a big difference. If you appeal, all of the onus is on you, the housing, it's not on the homeowner or the renter, it's on the housing developer. And so for me, the interesting part of that is that in 2017, 18, 19, when the big housing companies, Nanian Homes and others were saying, we can't do this. We kept saying, what we're doing is we are saying, we're going to give you more money because you're going to build in energy into your housing. Why are you objecting to us? Right? You should be clamoring for more rules like this because we're putting the CapEx, we're putting the value of homes higher. The people who should be objecting is the environmental justice. Because higher capital costs, unless there's a clear mechanism, are going to get reflected in higher rents and purchase prices. The problem is, of course, that poor people, brown people in the state cannot afford to buy homes anyway. So the challenge is, how do you work that backwards? So what we said was, you can appeal if you build a project in an area where you don't believe solar can work, but in 90% of those appeals, and there's been like 13 total since 2020, very few, we have found, yeah, solar can work, but not necessarily on your own home. So you build a housing project in an area that is cloudy, and you simply go rent space on the nearest Safeway store. You pay them for a rental housing fee, because the electrons don't have to be generated on your roof to go onto your bill. So we pushed back and won that one. But the broader question of getting the state to invest so that we don't take a good idea, like most are good ideas, we make them regressive, right? So we generally say, let's subsidize electric vehicles, let's subsidize heat pumps. And what that means is that rich people get to get them on their homes and we all pay for it, right? That is not a positive process. So I invite any of you who come down to Oakland to come visit the California Energy Commission funded project that we built in the Fruitvale section of Oakland. It's actually under construction now. It was delayed because of COVID. So this is the EcoBlock project. And the EcoBlock is something I co-direct with someone named Sasha von Meyer from electrical engineering. And it's to build a community solar array. All of the homes on which there is solar, the occupant or the owner, because the building in the corner here is an apartment building. And there's a grow house here, and then there's a fried chicken house here. And so everyone who opted in, and a few opted out, there's a libertarian on the block. Solar is put on all the rooftops, but it does not feed their meter directly. It all gets stored in this kinetic storage. There's a garage that got turned into a bank of flywheels that then powers all the homes. And the community had a long, year-long process to decide, do we distribute the energy back? Do we do it equally based on today? Do we do it per resident of the home? Do we do it based on some historical allocation? You know, if you already had a grow room and a hot tub, you might have a higher. And they eventually decided there would be a budget that each home got based on area. It was a little bit controversial because some people said if you number of occupants, but others said if you do occupants now, we're highlighting who might have visitors in their home who are maybe not legal residents. I don't use the word that starts with A. But they decided they would do it on a per unit area. That is an interesting one to go. It's not exactly the most equitable, but the community decided on it. And then they get their allocation and the energy demand for any home beyond that. They buy from their cooperative. And then what's left over at the end of the day, which only really happens in the spring, is they then sell that back to PG&E. PG&E was not helpful in getting this set up. And there's EV charging, but not in your driveway. The only EV chargings we would support were publicly available where you use a swipe card to access it, so that members who park on the block can access those public EV charging stations. So it's a long way around, but we fought back against, let's cut down that requirement for new solar. Right now we need requirements of no gas, and we need heat pumps. We need a whole variety of things to become part of the new landscape, and each one of those are going to be tough battles, I would say.
I have a question about the switch model. And so it essentially shows how renewables and storage can, in terms of private costs, actually the net present value can be better than a fossil plant. But since policymakers, a lot of times they're looking at social cost benefit analysis. If we try to integrate the switch model with something like the JEDI model, where they plug in these values to say, okay, if we build a fossil plant or renewable energy plus storage solution, this is how many jobs, this is how much sort of a GDP multiplier, investment multiplier we'll get. So is the switch model compatible with something that's used to do much more of a social cost benefit analysis like the JEDI model?
Yeah, so we don't work with the JEDI model. So two things. One is that I work with the Housing and Labor Office at Berkeley, And we've been producing jobs per dollar, jobs per megawatt reports, not based on economic models. I'm a physicist, I don't believe economics. And so we do it by polling companies. And so we hire undergraduates and they call up companies and they look at what was your revenues coming in, if they'll tell us, and what are the employment gains. And so, you know, you guys have probably all seen versions of this, the jobs numbers out there. And so we try to make it clear through empirical data that there are more jobs in the clean energy space than the fossil space. And we try to do that regularly. And I think I put it here. I might not be able to find it right off, which case I'll just tell the story. So the other thing we do, nope, not there, is we work closely with UT Austin and their national energy calculator to try to update the numbers and what we think the costs and the benefits are of different energy projects. And so what we have been highlighting, I'm just not seeing, oh, there it is, okay. So following Biden in his first full day in office, signing the social cost of carbon requirement that was then blocked by a conservative Louisiana judge and took 9 months to clear. If you go in and look at what is the overnight cost, so the cheapest cost for a new energy project across the country today, what you see here is that natural gas is cheapest in the Northwest, Southeast, solar is in mauve, wind is in green. We're going to leave the nuclear story aside because they do a very odd calculation for nuclear. But if we go from no cost of carbon to California's market cost, which is now $30, I think of it 20 in here, that map changes, right? But that's not the social cost of carbon. To get back to your question, social cost of carbon officially in the US is, I should expand this, right? It is, right now it's $50 a ton. So $50 a ton is here, but as hope you guys just saw just 3 weeks ago, Berkeley and Resources for the Future released their new study where they conclude that the social cost of carbon is $180 a ton. Big range, but we have been working with that because this is currently seen as the strongest tool at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So you go from $50 a ton, there's basically, it's a fossil-free world of new build-outs. But you go to 183, I mean now, and I don't think we're going to get to this number anytime soon, but it highlights that even this transition from the current price, zero across the country, again, leaving us out, leaving Reggie out in New England, to a moderate cost, to the current social cost would already get you to a build world where we are internalizing at least enough of the benefits, not the full story, that we would be building out a clean energy.
You talked about the reserve and the increase in the reserve from 15 to 17%. So are you saying that we should start to kind of build back our reserve so we would know the demand if we're always going to store solar or store wind, and so we would decrease that because if you increase it, it kind of incentivizes us to continue to use fossil fuels?
Absolutely, because our RPS target is not going to get us to zero carbon until well after 2030. And so the fact that we are increasing the reserve margin, and you can hear the argument, right? Renewables are intermittent, we haven't built enough storage yet, et cetera, et cetera. We need a bigger reserve margin. And in the world of renewables, we need a bigger reserve margin than the fossil fuel days. Data doesn't support that at all. Natural gas plants in California go offline very conveniently when the prices get too low because they're trying to exercise market power to get more revenues. Solar is on and off, right? We have this thing called nighttime. But solar is very predictable. Wind a little bit less so, right? But if we build storage reflecting what those actual supply curves look like, we can actually get quite far. And so a detail in the modeling I didn't explain just for time is that the way we do the modeling is you'll notice the times of day, 7 o'clock, 3 p.m., et cetera. For each month, what I've done is stitch together 2 days. We don't run the model for every hour, every day, all ready to run all of the West. It takes 9 hours to do a run. And of course, I want to do, I want to do carbon price from 0 to $100. So I am the #1 user of our supercomputer cluster. But we have stitched together the peak day and the average day and just put them side by side in each month. And so if I can do this, with my little in the basement supercluster, the state government can clearly do this in large amounts. And once you get there, what you find is that building out the right amount of storage and incentivizing storage the right way. So right now, there is no longer a subsidy to purchase solar in California for your roof, which I think is great, but there is a subsidy if you do storage and solar. That little bit of language change, I think, is a big deal in building out distributed storage. What we have not done, as you heard me whining about it at the beginning of the talk, is that we have not found a way to make this a good deal both for residents, both renters and homeowners, and the utility. And the utility deeply distrusts this build out, even though I keep saying, you know how rich those fossil fuel companies are? We're trying to give you all of their business. Why are you fighting us? And they fight every step of the way towards more revenue, right? So I keep saying, if you keep fighting it, we're only going to be supporting co-ops and munis and distributed community level projects because you are refusing to take our money, and I don't understand that. So interesting point.